monitoring, mapping, and EDRR session. We have a really great lineup of speakers, so really excited to get started. I'll pass it over to our moderator, Ruth, who is our communications intern at the Invasive Species Center, and she'll lead us through this session.
Thanks for the intro, Maddie. Hello, all. I will be introducing the speakers today. My name is Ruth. For our first speaker, we have Grace Rao from the American Bird Conservancy. She'll be presenting on coordinating invasive species management across a vast landscape of public lands. I'll pass it on to Grace.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to share my screen quick, and I apologize for my camera. For some reason, as I logged in, it decided to completely stop working. But can you see my screen okay?
It looks great.
Awesome. Well, like Ruth said, my name is Grace Rao. I'm with the American Bird Conservancy. I work as the invasive species coordinator out of Western Minnesota. And I'm really excited to be here and just get to dive in. So the first thing I would like to do is define what I mean by vast landscape of public lands and give you a bit of context for the area I work in. So my work area covers 10 counties in Western Minnesota. Primarily, I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service within those 10 counties. So you'll hear me talk about Morris and Big Stone, or the Morris-Big Stone complex. So that is the name of that 10 county area where I work. So that includes hundreds of scattered tracts. So we have about 300 across that 10 county area. We have a 11,000 acre national wildlife refuge, as well as other easements and smaller different federal lands that are within that 10 county area. And we manage both uplands and wetlands. This area is part of the waterfowl production area model, meaning that originally these lands were set aside for waterfowl habitat, but we also manage tall grass prairie in this area. So we are the far western edge of that kind of habitat. And that habitat, there's less than 1% remaining in the state of Minnesota. So that's remnant prairie or unplowed prairie. So that's a really high priority kind of management goal for us. And I want to emphasize that while we have a lot of acreage, our biggest operational challenge is the fact that those management units are so scattered and so fragmented. All right, so I began to talk about this, but why invasive species management is especially hard here. Like I said, with the fragmentation, we have a large number of neighbors, meaning that there are a large number of invasion fronts. So meaning that there's more opportunities for species to come onto the public lands. Logistically, it is a very kind of difficult way to manage land. The two farthest units from each other are about 2.5 hours driving away from each other. So getting staff and treatment equipment back and forth to different sites can be very difficult. And then because there are so many units, many are not annually visited or visited consistently, meaning that a lot of times we miss opportunities for early intervention with invasive species. So our management is often reactive rather than proactive. And then the last thing there is managing multiple priorities and treatment capacity. So managing tall grass prairie, it's a very disturbance dependent regime, meaning that the same staff that are responsible for invasive species are also responsible for the grazing, haying, and prescribed fire program on the same set of land. And this isn't from a lack of effort on the part of the staff here at the Morris-Big Stone complex. It's more of a systems issue and how we approach this managing invasive species in this landscape. So the prioritization problem, the doing invasive species prioritization was recognized as being important, but it was kind of consistently delayed for many years. And it's not that the complex staff were resistant, it's just overloaded with how to, fit in the time to do a full prioritization with while balancing their whole other workload. And one of the big things was that good prioritization needed to be theoretically sound, but also operationally usable. So not just a prioritization that they needed a prioritization that could be directly implemented into the field. So the solution to this problem was through partnerships. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partnered with American Bird Conservancy to create my position as invasive species coordinator. And just a little bit about American Bird Conservancy, their broader mission is to conserve birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. So grassland birds are in rapid decline, and by working to restore habitat in Western Minnesota, hopefully we are increasing the amount of grassland birds that we'll be seeing. And then the second half of that partnership solution is through Student Conservation Association. So this is how we got our seasonal field techs for each year. And then just a note on, these two different components. So the invasive species coordinator position is really meant to be a bridge between the planning efforts and the field work done by the invasive species strike teams, and really is a role to support efficiency and consistency and not, give a prescription for fish and wildlife staff. And then the strike teams are seasonal interns who do the actual field monitoring and invasive species treatment. So the prioritization kind of overview, this was designed to integrate the ecological importance of habitats, invasive species impact, and also management feasibility. The framework components were designed to not be an additional burden for U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff, so that it is practical and feasible for land managers to go through this process. So the first step was to create a master invasive species list across our 10-county landscape. We wanted to establish the full scope before we narrowed down species that we would be prioritizing. This also gives us an opportunity to review and update the list over time. We took this from county observations. So as species move in and throughout the complex area, this can be updated. The second step was to take that giant species list. There was about 250 species on it, and figure out what are our target species going into the plant prioritization tool and what species are not being prioritized. So species that go into the prioritization tool are species that are actively managed, monitored, or tracked by Fish and Wildlife staff. While species that were not included, there are a couple of categories kind of listed here on this flow chart. Mainly, they were either are invasive species but are not a concern to the habitats or area we are working in, or they're invasive and a concern, but they are just not yet on Fish and Wildlife land. And then that would be an early detection rapid response species if we did find it on Fish and Wildlife land. So a couple of examples for kind of our geography. Crown vetch is a huge problem for us out here. So that got plugged into our prioritization tool. The other example I have is garlic mustard. So in forested habitats, it tends to act more aggressively than it does in tall grass prairie. It really doesn't do well kind of out in the open. So for us, that is an invasive that we did not include because it is unlikely to invade our habitats of highest concern. And then poison hemlock is something that we are concerned about coming onto Fish and Wildlife land, but we don't have yet. So that is one that got onto our EDRR list. So basically we took these 35 species and ranked them based on a weighted criteria tool. So the graph on here shows where our 35 species fell on that. Basically, the species with the highest score are species that are newly established, spread quickly, and pose a high threat to priority resources, and the management is relatively easy. The next step was to rank our management units. So we have 320 management units in total. And there was an existing ranking framework, but when you have 300 units, you technically have 20 units that are the highest priority, and we had to find a way to narrow that down. So for each species, we ranked the units that we know had populations of that particular species. So the same thing, we used a weighted criteria tool to prioritize the units, and the units with the higher score are ones that are already ranked high on the existing prioritization model, have small populations with no adjacent external seed sources. The populations are in remnant prairie or highest priority habitats. There is some level of public use and visibility, and then also how close they are to the Morris Wetland Management District office. So that's where our seasonal staff and strike teams were based out of. So we wanted to give a lower priority to units that are, over an hour and a half away. So the output from this was our annual work plan. So this is, we have species that are kind of broken up into tiers. So we have our 3 top tier species, and then we kind of have a middle tier there. And what this gave us was very clear and achievable priorities, and it was directly usable by field staff. And so we had the strike teams basically check off units as they went for our first year implementing it. And it really reduced decision fatigue for staff, which was a really good benefit from having this year. And we decided to keep each unit by species just based on the treatment timing, since each of these species has a different treatment window throughout the summer. So I already kind of alluded to this. So we are implementing this prioritization plan at the Morris Big Stone Complex. So 2025 was our first year of implementation, and we had our staff guided by those prioritization outputs. So we really focused on the highest priority infestations, but also had room to address new threats as we discovered, new populations. And we're still in that kind of early stage learning curve, but this summer we were able to really focus on strategic action rather than reactive responses. So just a note on, how we are keeping track of all of this. So all of the work that Fish and Wildlife staff and then the strike teams do are collected as geo-referenced field actions. This is collected into a large Fish and Wildlife service database, and then it is easily shared from that database. It's easily shared across partners within our region. So adaptive review from our first year. So we are still refining the tool and still refining our process as we kind of go through this. So some of the successes were that we did have more clarity and efficiency for seasonal staff, and we had consistent treatment of the highest priority sites and species. And also a big thing for us was reducing reliance on institutional knowledge. So making sure that we had a very clear rationale for why we were doing what we were doing. Some of the challenges we were dealing with, there were still some deviation from priorities. So we had to kind of balance that. We were still dealing with reactive management. We didn't have a, perfect way of how to integrate those populations into the tool after we ran it. And we're still working on, complete staff buy-in and the best kind of management practices. So the biggest thing for this model is the fact that it's scalable across public lands. So your number of management units, your number of acres, but also it's scalable for management capacity. The fact that the tool can spit out, your highest priority species and your highest priority units means that you can, as your management capacity increases or decreases, you are still targeting those highest priority sites and populations. And then also the capacity that partnership can create by, creating this partnership with American Bird Conservancy and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We were really able to do a lot for invasive species this year, and I'm excited to see what we are going to do in continuing years. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I am happy to answer any questions people may have.
Thank you, Grace, for your presentation. Looking into the chat, I don't see any questions, so I'm just gonna usher in the next speaker. So up next we have Mauricio Spilleni. He is an ecologist with SPA, and he's going to be presenting on invasive species and climate change, vulnerability of transportation infrastructure in Ontario. Q&A has questions? Oh, sorry, I just saw that the Q&A has questions. My apologies. Okay, so I have two questions from Kayleen Falkenstein for Grace. What ended up being the strikes team split of types of control? How much time was spent on manual/mechanical versus chemical and other means? Was that part of your prioritization too? Is the level of manual labor involved? Grace, do you mind taking some time out to answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the it depended on the species and kind of depended on the site. So we have some sites where we will not use chemical control because of the quality of remnant prairie there, because we don't want to, risk harming that habitat. Um, I would say that it was for this strike team, it was pretty 50-50, and they exclusively used either mechanical or chemical control. We don't really do a lot of other control methods there. Um, the manual labor involved was included in that prioritization tool. So that's what was captured for the species management. There was an intensity and a complexity category. So intensity being how many times you have to return to the same population each season. And then complexity captures the type of treatment that we do. So something that would be less complex would be like something like a backpack spray or a biocontrol release or things like that. Whereas the highest level of complexity then is you need a contractor or you need to, dredge up a wetland to deal with Phragmites or cattail, or it's a very complex control method.
Kayleen also had another question. She wants to know what were some of your examples of deviation from priorities and reactive management? What caused these challenges to happen?
So for a lot of those deviations were other staff members, who weren't necessarily the strike team. They would find, populations of crown vetch or wild parsnip, which are our tier 2 species. So they weren't technically our highest priority species. And then because they were in, showcase units, so that's like our 20 top units, they, weren't on the list, but suddenly became priority. So that was really where we saw the reactive management, because we didn't have a great way to fit those into the prioritization as we were going in the summer.
Okay, I have one question from an anonymous attendee. They're asking, what software did you use to create the weighted rankings?
Yeah, so it really was just an Excel sheet, nothing crazy.
Okay, I have a question from Linda Bernst. How does EDD maps or broader mapping tools integrated into your regional species identification?
So I pulled the EDD maps species observations for the 10 counties that I worked in. So that species list was compiled based on observations from that data set. And also in Minnesota, we have the Department of Natural Resources has a like old survey data about species that they've figured that they've discovered in each county. So our species list was pulled from both of those.
So we're out of time for Grace questions for Grace, but I will be adding her email to the chat room in case anyone had any questions for her after the session. Up next we have Mauricio Spilleni speaking on invasive species and climate change, vulnerability of transportation in our infrastructure in Ontario. Take it away, Mauricio.
Hi everyone, it's fine.
Looks great.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I can start.
Yes, you can start.
Oh, hi everybody. Sorry. Thank you for this opportunity. On behalf of the company I represent at this forum, I would like to sincerely thank you for the valuable opportunity given to EcoGest and its Climate Change Study Center to present their research on monitoring and controlling invasive species with particular focus on the vulnerability of the transportation infrastructure caused by their presence. For over 30 years, we have been involved in the maintenance of the green spaces, both in urban contexts and along road and highways, becoming a recognized leader in sustainable vegetation management along road and highway networks in Italy, Europe, and now also in Canada and USA as EcoGest North America. In Canada and more generally in North America, the invasive plant species are one of the main human-driven pressure on natural ecosystem and transportation infrastructure. Their ability to adapt, grow rapidly, and colonize aggressively causes major change in the local ecological balance, with the direct consequence on the safety, on functionality, and management of cost of road and rail network. In particular, transportation infrastructure represents a major corridor of the spread of many invasive species due to habitat fragmentation, the movement of materials, sometimes for the poor maintenance of green spaces, and favorable environmental conditions along roadside, drainage ditches, interchanges, and marginal areas. These dynamics are further amplified by the effect of the climate change, with altered temperature and rainfall patterns, expanding of areas potentially suitable of colonization. The study focused on the analysis of invasive species that are particularly widespread and problematic in southern of Ontario. Common red Phragmites australis is a highly competitive hygrophilous species capable to rapidly colonizing ditches, wetland, and drainage system as well, altering their hydraulic functionality. The other species is a Japanese knowweed Fallopia japonica, characterized by an extremely aggressive root system capable of compromising the stability of the civil work, pavements, and contaminant structures. The last, giant hogweed, Heracleum mantegazzianum, is a species with a high ecological and health impact, which poses a risk to both biodiversity and the safety of operator and users of the infrastructure. The assessment of the current distribution and potential future expansion of invasive species was conducted using QGIS software, integrating georeferenced spatial data with environmental and climate variable In particular, the analysis considered the data on the occurrence and reporting of invasive species, the land use and vegetation cover, the proximity and continuity with the transportation infrastructure, the current climate variable, and climate change scenario. The approach adopted made it possible to identify preferred spread corridors, often coinciding with road and rail access and drainage network, and to develop qualitative risk map for the future colonization. The result of the analysis indicated that climate change has a significant influence on the distribution pattern and expansion process of the invasive species, favoring their colonization of the area previously considered ecologically unstable. The rise in average temperatures and the increasing frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events and change in rainfall patterns all contribute to increasing the susceptibility of transportation infrastructure to the establishment and spread of invasive species. The area characterized by high level of risk are associated with the following factors: high density and continuity of transportation in the infrastructure, as we can see in the picture, preference in the ditch embankment and surface drainage system, which has the preferential dispersal corridors, proximity to wetland and uncultivated or early distributed of human altered soil with reduced biotic competition, and in the end, untargeted and uncoordinated maintenance practice, potentially responsible for the secondary disposal of the propagules of this plant. Among the most significant impacts associated with the spread of the invasive species along the transportation corridor are inefficiency of obstruction of the road drainage system, with the consequent increase in the risk of flooding and pavement degradation, reducing visibility for the road users due to the uncontrolled vegetation growing along roadside or along the embankments, increases the risk of summer wildfire, especially in the presence of the accumulated dry biomass, increasing of maintenance costs linked to the need for repeated and specialized intervention, compromise of the ecological functionality of the ditches, of the drainage system, wetlands, and habitats connected to the infrastructure, with the loss of the native biodiversity. Based on the company's main years of experience in managing highway vegetation maintenance and transportation infrastructure, operational strategy aimed at mitigating and controlling invasive species have been identified, including continuous and systematic monitoring of areas at risk through the site inspection and updating of GIS data, selective and targeted mechanical removal, adapted on the specific characteristics on the individual species and the infrastructure context. In the end, this is very important, interinstitutional coordination between infrastructure management bodies, environmental authorities, associations, and specialized operators to ensure effective and consistent intervention over time. Final consideration. So the integration of GIS analysis, climate scenario, and operational know-how provides a strong foundation for the development of the future studios and adaptive management of the transportation infrastructure. This approach makes it possible to define priorities for action, optimize available resources, and develop mitigation and adaptation strategies tailored to areas at increasing risk, taking into account the dynamic induced by climate changes on the distribution of invasive species. I hope I have been exhaustive for this presentation. Any question, email me or text me. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for your presentation. I'm just going to wait a little bit to see if we get any questions in the Q&A. So I still don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I will add Fabrizio's email to the chat in case anything comes up after he's gone.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yep. So introducing our next speaker, we have two speakers, Diane McClaw and Dr. Marilyn Carey. They're from the Niagara, Peninsula of Conservative Authority and Brock University, presenting on collaborative conservation, GeoAI mapping for a healthier Niagara watershed. Take it away from here.
Thank you, Ruth. Hi, everyone. My name is Marilyn Carey, and I'm an associate professor in the Environmental Sustainability Research Center at Brock. And I'm joined here with my colleague, Diane McCullough, who is the GIS analyst from Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. The Conservation Authority is one of actually 36 in the province of Ontario, and it manages about 41 natural areas within the watershed. I just want to note that this project is funded through the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund. That funding was received back in 2025. So as many of you know, of course, invasive Phragmites is a challenge for us here in the region. Oh, I just lost my screen. I'm really sorry. I'm just going to have to share again. Okay, sorry about that. Can you see it?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So as you know, invasive frag threatens biodiversity and causes significant challenges, both economically, socially, but also in terms of environmental impacts on the watershed. So NPCA has served as a regional lead for mapping invasive Phragmites through an agreement with the Invasive Species Center. And on the right, you can see what Phragmites looks like. For those of you who have not worked in these landscapes before, they can be up to 10 feet tall. It's a perennial grass that's found across the province of Ontario and across the globe, really, as we heard from other talks today. So we have spent a lot of time partnering with different local organizations, municipalities, to bring groups together to come up with some way to standardize management in the watershed. And it's maybe great to share that the NPCA has established the Niagara Phragmites Management Area Collaborative, and more recently, an Invasive Species Strategy Advisory Committee. So that's really exciting. We're making great progress. Today, Diane and I are focusing on geospatial technologies, particularly GIS and remote sensing, as they play an important role in mapping, monitoring, and managing the species effectively. So how do we actually find where Phragmites is in the landscape? There's a couple of different ways. Field work is often a great way to determine Phragmites locations, but it's not particularly cost effective. Also, navigating remote wetlands and accessing private lands can be really challenging. So some of the work that we've done in the geospatial world is to kind of look from above using drones or aircraft and even spacecraft to study Phragmites distribution. The challenge is that drones tend to cover just small areas, but in really great detail. They can be quite costly though, versus ortho imagery, some of which can be free, but it comes with a lower spatial resolution. And then of course there's satellite data. And again, depending on the data you're using, it can be expensive. The other important consideration is the cost benefit or return on investment, where we're trying to achieve good enough, right? We don't need to have accuracies of 98% identification, but to have a good sense of where Phragmites are in the landscape, and then to actually go out and confirm them in the field and then treat them. So I'm involved in this project because it's important to work collaboratively so that we can actually share resources. And so the NPCA has taken me in a bit as they've adopted me into the Conservation Authority, which is lovely. So I get to share this presentation today with Diane, and I'll tell you a little bit about some recent studies. For those of you working in this region, you'll know that a lot of work has been done out of Long Point and other wetland areas, but also here more locally. Pat Chow Fraser out of McMaster has done a lot of work, but there's others now working in different parts of the province, including Windsor, U of T, etc., to look at these different airborne and satellite data, as well as methods that can be used to effectively map this invasive species. And we've been quite successful with these more sort of traditional approaches, particularly to image classification or object-based image classification. However, we've not really explored geospatial artificial intelligence or GeoAI techniques and how they might be used for this purpose. So the goal of this study is to look at the Niagara Peninsula watershed and try to map that area, or at least several different pockets, depending on what organizations and municipalities are ready to do that mapping. We want to map the spatial extent and distribution of Phragmites and compare these traditional approaches to more recently available approaches using geospatial AI, and in particular deep learning for improved mapping of Phragmites. So I'll pass over to Diane now, but I just want to note that we were using ArcGIS for a lot of the work conducted in this study. Thanks.
So I'm just going to speak to our data and methods for this this project. So the NPCA has access to high spatial resolution 10 centimeter ortho imagery of the Niagara region, flown in spring of 2023. So the images were taken between March 30th and April 8th, flown over a few dates, and then stitched together to create a mosaic over our entire watershed. We did also use some swoop data. It's the Southwestern Ontario Orthophotography Project from 2020, which was just used in some early testing. So with the 2023 imagery, we have access to 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles, which we're able to classify, whereas the regional mosaic as a whole is just much too large to perform image classification on. So we had some NPCA staff provide us with 3 confirmed sites of Phragmites in the city of Welland and Niagara Falls. And we also had the City of Niagara Falls and the Niagara Parks Commission share field confirmed sites of Phragmites within Niagara Falls. So our study used these known Phragmites locations to assess GeoAI classification accuracy against traditional supervised classification methods to determine the best approach for detection. So the photo on the right here will show you an image of known locations of Phragmites in Niagara Falls, all highlighted in red. Next slide. So just to review the pixel-based classification methods, most of you will be familiar with the look of satellite images, but unless we analyze the data, there isn't much value add. So we'll take numeric data and add an algorithm to the data that then groups pixels into known land use or land cover types. So for our study, we focused on pixel-based image classification. We did try object-based classification for both GeoAI and traditional methods. However, it did not produce a useful result. It may seem odd that we even tried object-based classifications for this. However, we believed it would have been more foolish for us to not try and assume that we knew the answer. So the traditional supervised pixel-based image classification will use a defined land cover or land use classification system and assign classes to all of the pixels in the remotely sensed image. So this process decides which class each pixel belongs to just on an individual basis. With GeoAI and deep learning, we take a more sophisticated approach where we train a model to run the classification. So once we have these results, we can make a comparison between both methods and see which works best. Deep learning in image classification essentially trains an AI system to learn from a training model or a deep learning model, and is able to classify the image based on any patterns that it recognizes. So for our study, we use the classify pixels using deep learning method. So this runs a trained deep learning model on the image, and it'll create a classified image with each pixel assigned to a class. Next slide. So a brief run through of our methods. We first had to determine a classification schema for our classification. So we began using the National Land Cover Database schema and then added a Phragmites class. Then realized that we don't have all of the classes included in the National Land Cover Database schema within our watershed. So we narrowed that down to 6 classes with the Phragmites inclusive. You can see that listed on the screen now. We would typically see Phragmites be included with that herbaceous class. However, because we want to isolate Phragmites as its own class, Phragmites has a pronounced seed head and is easily differentiated by that seed head. So because of this, we're able to differentiate Phragmites as separate from that herbaceous class. We use the same training sites for each method. This way we can ensure that we're comparing apples to apples. And through some testing, we've inferred that gravel piles in, say, construction sites, or sun reflecting on water ripples, has similar spectral patterns as Phragmites. So we saw some misclassification there, as well as deciduous forests in our spring imagery because there's no canopy. It was often mistaken for Phragmites stalks. So we did do some refining to produce a more accurate result, but we didn't want to refine the model too much. We figured it's better to have gravel classified as Phragmites rather than Phragmites classified as gravel. This way we can ensure that there's no loss in potential Phragmites. More recently, we've been testing and generating models on more locations we've become aware of and obtaining some improved results, which we will speak to later in the presentation. So on the screen here is just some of our preliminary results. So this is still using that 2023 imagery, and these are just our first initial results, which did show promise. So we took 3 imagery tiles from within our watershed with known Phragmites, and we ran both a supervised and a GeoAI pixel-based classification on each. So the first column you see shows the original imagery tiles, highlighting where the Phragmites is located, which was confirmed by fieldwork. The 3 tile images contain a variety of land cover, all included in our classification schema. So grassland, forest, developed and paved lands, water, and of course Phragmites. So running each classification type on all of these images allowed us to compare the results of each method across multiple images. So from this process, we were able to determine that both of the classifications did display potential Phragmites locations, but there appears to be a significant difference in the results from the traditional versus GeoAI methods. This also led us to understand that further refinement of our model or increasing training sample size may improve our results. And based on the testing that we've completed, the GeoAI method is yielding promising outputs, but does require significant pre-processing in order to achieve these results, where the classify pixels classification method also provides an adequate result to model and identify Phragmites. There's more work to be done, and we've also continued refining and testing our methodologies.
So just to show you some of the results of our accuracy assessments, this is called a confusion matrix that you're looking at. It's a cross tabulation of classified data versus field referenced data. And so we performed accuracy assessment. The top table shows you the results of a traditional supervised image classification, whereas the bottom is what we were getting from our initial test trials through using GeoAI. And just for those of you who may not know, accuracy assessment basically measures the agreement between a standard that's known to be correct versus an image classification of unknown quality. And we say that a result is acceptable, usually when we hit about 80 to 85% accuracy. So for these tests, we used well-known field verified test sites, over 50 random test sites that we use to calculate these accuracies on. For all land use land cover types, but you'll see Phragmites identified here, where accuracies were pretty low on the 60% users accuracy, for example, compared to over 70% using geospatial AI. So we noticed that we were getting quite a bit better accuracies, but we started to refine the model a little bit more to see if we could make that even better. We know that these accuracies are typical for existing studies, so we wanted to push that a little bit further. And so I'll just share the next screen with you for Diane.
Yeah, so as Marilyn mentioned, like as time has gone on, we've continued to refine our model and also generate additional models using other known locations of Phragmites. So on the top right of the screen is an imagery tile showing an area of Thorold along the operational well and canal. So on the left side of this image, it shows a large patch of Phragmites, which is the largest known location that we have identified at this point. So I used this image to generate another GeoAI model in hopes that it would provide us with a more accurate classification result, as there's more Phragmites present in the image compared to our previous attempts. So with significantly more Phragmites present in the image, we have the ability to create more training areas or training sites, which will better teach the model of the spectral signature and patterns of Phragmites within the aerial image. And so the large image you see on the screen is the first output raster generated from the model. And from here, I refine the model and refine the model and refine some more. And so that's just adding additional training areas to help assist the model learn which spectral signatures belong to which class. And so this last image here shows the output from our most updated model. And through accuracy assessments, we've determined that the accuracy of this model gives us 75% accuracy overall, and this is on this image. 75% accuracy overall and 76% accuracy of the Phragmites class. Next slide. So here you'll see the results of the accuracy assessment completed on our Niagara Falls location. So this image was classified using the model I just spoke about in my previous slide, housing that the largest known patch of Phragmites that we've identified. So this accuracy assessment shows us the positive impact of using a higher number of Phragmites training sites. We can see an increased accuracy of pixel classification throughout the image and throughout the classes, and obtaining almost an 80% accuracy for the Phragmites classification. So from here, we'll still work further to refine this model even more with the goal of reaching that 85% accuracy.
Thanks, Diane. So just a couple of next steps. We want to then compare purchased high spatial resolution satellite imagery for the same time period as the swoop data and compare those results to determine which might give us better results. And we're also looking at making some comparisons over the growing season as well. July to October has been identified as a good time frame to look at Phragmites growth as well. So we're looking to see if that yields better results than what we can get from spring. And then lastly, we're going to apply this methodology to map Phragmites in 3 NPCA conservation areas using swoop imagery. I just want to flag that the team on the right of this graphic, Carrie Royer at NPCA, has been also involved in this project, as well as Wendy Balden and Eric Balden. And Wendy's moved on from NPCA, but she played a huge role in the success of this project to date. So in conclusion, led by the NPCA, the research findings are contributing to a broader initiative to establish a watershed-wide invasive species strategy. And by using advanced geospatial technologies and together with our community-driven conservation efforts, this study is supporting more effective invasive species management, control, and protecting biodiversity in one of Canada's most biodiverse and threatened ecoregions. And Diane and I both thank you for your time, and we welcome questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Diane and Marilyn. I'm just looking into the Q&A and seeing if we have any questions. I will also be adding Diane and Marilyn's emails to the chat in case anyone thinks of something later. Oh. Oh, okay. I just saw someone say they had a question for Diane and Marilyn. What time of year has the best imagery for isolating Phragmites and minimizing erroneous ID?
Marilyn, do you want to go ahead or do you want?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, from studies that we've read, the best months to identify Phragmites is between July and October. So for our next steps, we're looking to obtain a satellite imagery or ortho imagery from those months to run our model on or to generate a model using the same sample sites to see if that will give us a better return.
I can add, Ruth, that some studies have found it helpful when you're trying to differentiate frag from other land use land cover types, especially if you're in a wetland environment with cattails, that spring imagery can add additional information to help differentiate. And some even use winter. You see right now the snow pile, Phragmites is really obvious in the landscape. So it's dependent on, what landscape you're operating in too. But yeah, overall, July to October seems to be the best time. Thanks for the question.
Of course. One last question before we end our session, to help with the transition to the next session. For management, what matters more, minimizing missed phragmites patches, that is false negatives, or minimizing wasted field visits, that is false positives? And how are you choosing the best thresholds or trade-offs for real-world operations and budgets?
At this time, like we're not really working on the management side. It's more of the like of identifying Phragmites throughout our watershed. So I'm not sure, Marilyn, if you can speak to
Well,
that anymore.
yeah, this approach is what we're using to see if we could get even better accuracy to identify and build up um, this library, if you will, of information about Phragmites. But I know that the NPCA is, of course, looking at management as well. And so it's important for us to do the best we can without spending too many resources to get a good sense of where frag is in the landscape and then field check that. Now, I know I see a question about citizen reports on Phragmites, so I just want to flag that eventually I think the plan is to also have a tool available on a cell phone app, for example, where you can report incidents of Phragmites in the landscape to help those management efforts, right? This watershed is massive. It's about 2,500 kilometers squared. So it's a very large area, and not every municipality has the resources right now to be doing this mapping. So it's a real group or team effort, and that's why we've developed this massive team to look at the mapping pieces all the way to the management side of it. For Diane and I, we're at the stages of testing this now in specific field sites to look at how, what the accuracies we're getting. And then we'll be eventually looking at, what's preferable, right? A missed identification, etc. Yeah.
Wow, we have so many more questions, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna let you guys email your questions to Diane and Marilyn directly. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Marilyn and Diane, for your presentation.
Thank
We
you.
have a next section in the next 3 minutes, and I'll just allow everyone to take that time to get ready for the next session.
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ruth. And thank you to all of our speakers for a really great session. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our attendees did too. So I really appreciate your time. Just wanted to note for everybody listening here, just in cases of interest, the Invasive Species Center does host a webinar series throughout the year. So each month we welcome experts from across North America to share their expertise on a variety of invasive species topics, from innovative management, new research, and community science. So if you enjoyed these talks, then you might also enjoy our virtual webinars too. So you can sign up on our website if you're ever interested in that. We'll meet you over in our next session starting really soon in just a few minutes to hear all about policy and innovative solutions. Thank you, everybody.